Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. Please watch this entire educational video to learn more about the importance of an interpreter who will come with you on the day of your naturalization interview. If you are an applicant who is not fluent in English and requires use of an interpreter for your naturalization interview, then you need to know about the importance of an interpreter during your naturalization interview. During the interview, the interpreter should present a valid government-issued identity document and complete an interpreter's oath and privacy release statement. Your interpreter should be able to translate what the officer, and you as the applicant, say word for word without adding any additional commentary, opinion, or answer. As a general rule, a disinterested party is highly recommended as the interpreter. What is a disinterested party? A disinterested third party means a person not related to the applicant to be interviewed, and is not concerned, with respect to possible gain or loss, in the result of the pending final interview and examination. The immigration officer may use or apply his or her own opinion or judgment, whether to allow a friend or relative of the applicant to act as interpreter. If the USCIS officer is fluent in the applicant's preferred language, then the immigration officer may conduct the examination in that language without use of an interpreter. Please remember that the USCIS reserves the right to disqualify an interpreter provided by any applicant, if the immigration officer believes the integrity of the interview and examination is compromised by the interpreter's participation, or the USCIS officer officially decides, based on facts, that the interpreter is not competent to translate. If you are going to a naturalization interview with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, it's important for you to be able to understand everything that is going on in the interview. If you can't understand English, then you need to get a good interpreter who fluently understands and speaks English so that the interview process will not become complicated. An interpreter has many roles, and it is essential that this person is qualified to fulfill the duties in a naturalization interview that is so important for the applicant. What is an interpreter? An interpreter is a person who converts information from one spoken language into another. This is a person whose work is to translate a foreign language verbally or orally, as in a conversation between people speaking different languages. So as an applicant, it's your job to get a good interpreter during your interview. Your interpreter will change what you will say into another language so that the immigration officer will be able to understand during your interview. What is a translator? A person who generally handles only written text form. Sometimes people will be confused whether they will get an interpreter or a translator. That is why we want to explain the difference between the two. A translator is a person who translates written speech from one language to another. During your naturalization interview, you don't need to have a translator, but you need to have a good interpreter. If you are looking for a qualified interpreter for your naturalization interview, you don't need to pay a professional. The USCIS policy memo only states that the person must be able to do the work, so you can easily find an adult friend who is capable of handling this role so that you can save money too. You can also visit the local nonprofit organizations where you live that are serving immigrants. You also have an option to search online and hire someone who will offer the service with a discounted price. Just be careful not to be scammed when looking for this kind of service. You may avoid a family member or your lawyer as an interpreter for your naturalization interview. Please remember that USCIS policy and guidelines has the power to disqualify someone from serving as interpreter, especially if the person is not sufficiently fluent in the applicant's or interviewee's language and also in English. A qualified interpreter should be able to interpret impartially, competently, and without bias. So for example, a family member with a personal interest in the outcome of your application case may not be allowed to serve as interpreter, since this person may try to help give an answer to the applicant, instead of just interpreting only. A family member could usually be disfavored as an interpreter if there is another qualified interpreter available to the applicant or interviewee. In the end, this is really a matter of the discretion by the interviewing USCIS officer, whether a family member shall be allowed to become the interpreter. You and your interpreter should practice before the naturalization interview. In this way, it's easier for your interpreter to translate speech verbally for you. You have to speak in a clear and slow manner, and pause for a couple of words, or each sentence, in order to give your interpreter the chance to fully hear and understand what you said, since your interpreter still needs to translate these words into English correctly. The constant practice is very good, so that your interpreter will have time to get used to your pronunciation and how you say words in a sentence. Please know the important paperwork that your interpreter should submit to the USCIS. You and your interpreter will have to jointly submit the Form G-1256, Declaration for Interpreted USCIS Interview. You as the interviewee or applicant and the interpreter will be asked to sign this form at the beginning of the USCIS naturalization interview. This form declaration states that the interpreter must fully, accurately, and word-for-word interpret for both the interviewee or applicant and of the interviewing USCIS officer. It also makes the applicant or interviewee understand that an interpreter will be able to hear some personal information, and requires the interpreter to agree not to disclose any knowledge or information acquired during the naturalization interview. During your naturalization interview, your interpreter must show fluency in both English and in your native language. One very important role that an interpreter is responsible for is to only use the exact same words from the applicant and the immigration officer throughout the entire interview. The interpreter should never paraphrase or provide any additional commentary or own opinion to the applicant or to the immigration officer. In case that the interpreter will not be able to get an exact translation from English to the native language of the interviewee or the applicant, the interpreter should inform the immigration officer that another terminology needs to be used. The interpreter for your naturalization interview can be disqualified if there is a failure in meeting the important qualifications, like if you, as the applicant, is showing confusion and misunderstanding throughout the whole interview, and if the USCIS officer suspects that the interpreter is changing some of the answers throughout the interview. An interpreter should never coach the applicant on what to say during a naturalization interview. There are applicants who can bring interpreters with them during their naturalization interviews for American citizenship. So for example, if you are an applicant over 50 years old, and has lived in the United States for at least 20 years, then the 50/20ths exception rule will apply to you. You should have a valid permanent resident card, also known as a green card. With this exception, you can request to take the civics test, in your native language or the language that you always use from your home country. The other exception is the 55/15ths, which applies to applicants over the age of 55 and who have lived in the United States for at least 15 years and have a valid permanent resident card. This is another exemption to take the civics citizenship test in your native language. For applicants with the 50/20ths, 55/15ths exemptions, you can take the 100 civics test questions in your native language. For applicants 65 years old and older, who have been a permanent resident for at least 20 years, you can choose an easier version of the civics test in your native language. This is commonly known as the 65/20ths exception rule. For applicants with the 65/20ths exception, you can take the 20 civics test questions, that have an asterisk for each question, in your native language. Another exception which applicants will not be able to take the citizenship test, is a medical disability. If the applicant can legally show a physical disability, or a mental impairment that wouldn't allow the applicant to comply with the needed requirements, then a request for an exemption is valid with applicable and significant medical records. Simply file Form N-648, Medical Certification for Disability Exceptions. A medical practitioner should certify the Form N-648 within 6 months of the application date. An applicant should inform the USCIS about the request of exemption in advance, so that the USCIS officer, who will handle the application case, will know about it, before the USCIS will schedule the citizenship interview and test. An applicant who requests for an exemption needs to write an official cover letter, and present the case to the USCIS together with the Form N-400, Application for Naturalization Packet, or package when filing for citizenship. Please remember that there is a section in the Form N-400 that is meant for seeking those exceptions. The applicant shall choose the exception in number 13, page 2 of the N-400 form application, under Part 2, Information about you, and you can choose yes, either for 50/20ths, 55/15ths, or 65/20ths. Once you are approved for your application, you need to bring an interpreter with you to the citizenship interview and test. If you have any questions, please let us know, and we will try to answer them in the comments section below this video. You can also suggest additional topics that you want us to cover for our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.